since we have done the Lunch and Learn series, I have a better understanding of knowing that not only if it's my right to make sure that my partner knows how to vote, there is also my way to make sure the students know how to vote as well and understand the literature that comes with the importance of voting. I'm going to give the floor over to our student volunteer, Emily Jane, and she is going to introduce our speaker for today's Lunch and Learn series.
Hi, my name is Emily Jane Hardy. I'm the treasurer for the undergraduate social work organization and also Phi Alpha. And I was chosen to get to introduce Dr. Ruggiano. So Dr. Nicole Ruggiano is an associate professor and interim director of the doctoral social work program within our School of Social Work. Dr. Ruggiano's research focuses on developing and testing technologies that support older adults with dementia and their families. As an advocate, she is actively involved with improving policies and services for older adults with chronic conditions. And from 2018 to 2019, Dr. Ruggiano served as an American Political Science Association Health and Aging Congressional Scholar. Thank you, Dr. Ruggiano.
Oh, it's my pleasure to talk today. I'm very excited to present the information that I'm going to talk about. I spent a year in Washington part-time while still fulfilling my roles at the university. And so this is a really great opportunity of taking some of the things that I learned and sharing that with others. And I'm going to share my screen because I put together a PowerPoint presentation, but you should be able to still follow even if you are just calling in on the phone. So a little bit about the Congressional Fellowship. So I was an APSA Congressional Fellow, and the American Political Science Association has several smaller fellowships within that. So I was a Health and Aging Policy Fellow. There were also Robert Wood Johnson Fellows and Journalism Fellows, but there's also other organizations that offer Congressional Fellowships. And so I wanted to talk a bit about it because this is an opportunity that many of you might be interested in. So for instance, the Congressional Black Caucus has their own congressional fellowship. And so African-American students later on, you might be interested in getting more experience in Washington. There are also other organizations that you can look up whether they offer fellowships, and it's really good opportunity for training if you wanted to get more involved in the political realm. So as an APSA fellow, here's our APSA class at graduation. So here's our graduation ceremony at the Senate building. And so here's me and my family. We had a private tour of the Speaker of the House's suite, and this is the Speaker's balcony. So when I wasn't in Washington, I was still doing my faculty roles. My PhD is actually in urban affairs and public policy. I do have an MSW, but I've always been interested in public policy and changing social issues from a macro perspective. As a faculty member at the University of Alabama, I am the director of the DSW program. I also do a lot of involvement in public policy and advocacy for older adults and their families. And also health social work. So I'm very much in the community still. I do a lot of public health education, particularly in underserved communities. I do a lot of work in Tuskegee, where I do a lot of education for caregivers and older adults about dementia and caregiving issues. I'm also a health services researcher. So I've done research on chronic care self-management of older adults, but more recently I've done most of my work in dementia care and caregiving. And much of this has been in developing health information technologies that can improve the lives and experiences of people with dementia and their caregivers. Now in Washington, even though it was called a congressional fellowship, I actually elected to work for the executive branch of government, and I chose a fellowship in working with the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And the reason why I did that is because it really fell in alignment with a lot of the work that I do at the university in healthcare. So part of my fellowship was 6 weeks full-time in Washington, daily trainings from morning to night from experts in Washington, D.C. So some of them were at think tanks, they were federal government employees, they were current legislative aides, former congressional members. So it was very interesting, and I learned so much about different aspects of policy and political issues. So at ARC, I chose that because the focus of that agency is on health service delivery. They are really focused on improving the quality of care, where the NIH, which you might be more familiar with, focuses on actual health and experience of health. This agency focuses on improving the quality of care that providers give you, developing best practices, and offering different recommendations for things like immunizations and issues like that. It also gave me the opportunity to work on health information technology, which I mentioned is part of my research. So ARC actually has a very large grant to develop an e-care planning platform that would allow providers across institutions and also family members to contribute to an e-care plan for older adults with multiple chronic conditions. And in addition to that, I did a lot of work with them on their multiple chronic care initiative. So the NIH is broken down into individual institutes that focus on typically individual issues. So, you know, you have kidney care or cancer, but ARC is very interested in the experience of older adults who have multiple chronic conditions and how that's very unique as opposed to people dealing with one. And so I did a lot of stakeholder engagement and looking at the landscape in terms of healthcare and multiple chronic conditions. And the work that we did actually resulted in a line item budget of the president's budget of $45 million. So it was really exciting to see how that work played out. I also got to, so even though I didn't work in Congress, I got to prepare messages for congressional stakeholders. So here we are at the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. We were invited to talk about multiple chronic conditions and how it's impacting Hispanic communities. And so I was able to contribute to Congress and by educating people about some of the issues that we were working on. So that's just a little bit about the fellowship, but one thing that was very interesting was to learn more about politics and the political process and how the impact of our vote can affect what's going on in Congress. And one of the reasons why this really impacted me is because I was at that 6-week training during the November 2018 election. And so we woke up the day after the election, we went to the Congressional Research Service for our training, and she had to revise a whole bunch of things that she was going to talk to us because of the changes in Congress after that election. So the 2018 election, the Republicans remained control of the Senate, but what was very interesting was that Democrats flipped control in the House. So prior to the 2018 election, the Republicans had control of the House, and so now they didn't, and so you have a Republican-led Senate and a Democratic led House. And so if you follow the news, you can see how that has created very unique circumstances over the last 2 years. Congress also became more diverse. So we saw more women and also members of the LGBTQ community winning races. There were more racial and ethnic minorities who came to office, and also religion. So, and there's been a lot of media around people who are Muslim or Sikhs who also were elected to office, and these were very interesting times that we see different religions playing a larger role in the races that people were elected to. So state and local governments also had changes. They also became more diverse, but Democrats gained 7 gubernatorial seats and Republicans lost 6. So this was also a change that we saw as a result of the November 2018 elections. Now, feel like when most voters go, they say, I'm going to go for this person and this person will vote the way that I am interested in. And it kind of loses the big picture of what happens with the majority party. So obviously the majority party in Congress would get more votes. So there would be more people from that party who could vote on individual policies. But I learned, and these are things I didn't know before going, it's a lot more than that. So first they get more leadership roles, and that could be leadership roles in committees, and the committees are the groups that decide on a lot of the language or what should be in and not in legislation as it moves forward and before it goes to vote. But also, the majority party gets to decide on the rules of the House or the Senate. And so we've seen how rules have changed. So for instance, if the change in the percentage of votes needed to make certain types of decisions in Congress, making it easier for the majority party to get what they want, or rules about things like the filibuster. So there are different rules of how Congress works, and that can change from Congress to Congress as different parties are in charge. There also are more seats on committees for the majority party, and I didn't realize this as well. So, so when you have the committee, the majority of that committee will be represented by the majority party in office. Also, the majority group congressional staff, they get more staff and resources. So what I found very interesting is when a party is the majority party in Congress, yes, there's more votes from that party for individual policy votes, but it also stacks the deck that the majority party can get more what they want because they have more resources, they have more opportunities of making rules about how policy making is done. And so for instance, when the House was flipped and all of a sudden the Democrats were a majority, a lot of staffers actually got fired or laid off because they worked for Republicans who no longer were able to have the number of staff that they previously were given. And so that was very interesting. The other thing I think is very interesting about politics is that many young Americans don't vote or want to get involved in politics because they're really disenchanted with the party system. And I'm sure many of you, we can have discussion at the end, really are getting tired of just seeing people fight back and forth, whether it's Republicans against Democrats or the opposite. And what happens is that when people are not that excited about the policies that are up for play, they just wind up not getting involved at all or voting because they're really disheartened by the whole political system. If we look at patterns of younger voters, they're less likely to feel that existing parties address their needs. They feel like the parties are outdated. Many young voters, they feel like they don't have enough knowledge about the parties or civics in general to make an informed choice. So if all of your knowledge about politics is what you see on the news, then you might not feel like you know enough to make a good choice. And you also might feel that parties have devised a system that minimizes votes. So when we see things like gerrymandering, where the majority party gets to change the voting district lines, and so they actually get to choose who's going to be in which district, and that has been a problem over time because it can stack the deck. We actually saw something very historical this week that the Democrats were very upset in Wisconsin because the governor wanted to push ahead the primary election to June because of coronavirus, and the Republican majority in the state government, they filed with the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overruled and required that the Wisconsin voters go to vote this week. That was really interesting, and there were a lot of people were very upset about this. Now, what's interesting about political parties, we didn't always have them. And so when George Washington actually gave his farewell address after his presidency, he warned us about the dangers of political parties. Specifically, he was concerned that if you have opposing political parties, that it would give parties the potential ability to stop policies from being enacted. So if we had policies that were passed, stopping those policies from taking place, or just disrupting the powers of the individual branches of government that they disagreed with but are supposed to be outlined in the Constitution. So the executive branch, the judicial branch, and Congress all have powers and activities that they're required to perform that are highlighted in the Constitution. And he was very concerned that political parties could get in the way of that. What's interesting is that he wasn't wrong, that we have actually seen these things take place over time because of opposing political parties. So this was just a general discussion about political parties and politics, but I've learned a lot on how we've gotten to where we are today. Most Americans do feel that Congress is very polarized and divided. And so these were issues that I wanted to learn a lot more about. Outside of DC, I feel like it looks like people are just fighting all the time. And so here's a picture of boxing gloves. So DC from outside the belt really looks like everybody's just fighting on a daily basis. I will say, and this was very heartening, that I got to see a lot more bipartisan work than what we see from outside of DC. And there are specific topics that even Republicans and Democrats together have rallied around. We actually recently witnessed this with the CARES Act. So we have both Republicans and Democrats really wanting to do something to address coronavirus and its economic impact, and also the health impacts of communities, and they work together to put together an enormous bill. So tremendous spending that's ideally going to help communities become healthier as we move forward through this, and also try to help them economically. Alzheimer's disease, which is my area of research, has also been a bipartisan, has received bipartisan support, and that's been very exciting to see as well, that there are these topics that both parties will rally around. But despite these bipartisan successes, Congress is still very divided on many issues, and I was very curious about how we've gotten to where we are. And so a little history, and I didn't know this, that for about 40 years, Democrats controlled the House. And in fact, Republicans during that time didn't even think it would be possible for them to control the House ever again. But then in 1994 election changed this. So in the 1994 election, Republicans gained a majority of the House and the Senate. So this was something that even surprised them. And also 2 Democratic senators switched parties, which further increased their majority in the Senate. And interestingly enough, one of them is Richard Shelby, who is still currently a sitting senator as a Republican. And we also saw parties flip to Republican in local elections as well. So similarly to the 2018 election, where we saw a flip towards the Democrats, 1994 was the opposite. But a good question is, how did they do this? How did this happen? So one of the trends that we've seen in politics since 1994 is tribalism and messaging, and how those have been used to influence individuals, whether it's legislators themselves, but also the voting public, about political parties. So just the definition of tribalism is just very strong loyalty to a tribe above other groups, and strong in-group loyalty. And so what we see is that there's been more of a sense of people in the Republican Party and people in the Democratic Party being loyal to those parties over policy issues, and being very loyal to those parties. And so some trends have really influenced this. So first of all, since the 1990s, Republican voters have actually become more cohesive as a group. They are voting more as a group together, and they have developed more strong of a loyalty than the Democratic Party. The Republicans have also tied religious values to conservatism. And that's been very interesting because if we go to tribalism, researchers have shown that more than 40% of each party, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, describe members of the other party as evil, which I think is really terrible, but that's really where we've come. And a lot of it has to do with these values that draw people to the individual parties and making them look down upon the other party. The Republican congressional majorities over time have actually been less bipartisan than Democratic congressional majorities. So what does that mean? When Republicans have had control in Congress, they have been less likely to compromise with Democrats, and they've also have given Democrats less time on the floor to introduce and discuss their bills than when Democrats have been in office. And so there's many potential explanations for that. One, you could say that Republicans have less value for bipartisanship, but another way that we can look at it is that Republicans feel that their policy positions are more no budging issues, that there really isn't room for compromise because they feel that their positions are too important. Those are just two different potential explanations. And also, the Democratic Party has not unified over policy positions the same way that Republicans have. So look at even the primaries that have been taking place over the last months. How many different approaches to healthcare have we talked about? Whether it is the current state of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare versus Medicare for all, or all these other different positions. So even in something that the Democrats all feel that healthcare is very important, they haven't been able to come to a unified message on how that's supposed to look. So in addition to tribalism and messaging, we also have witnessed this erosion of the separation of powers, and that has been very problematic. So for instance, we see that the president who is sitting in, and this has been for both Democratic and Republican parties, the group in Congress who shares the same political party with the president over time has started to look at the president as the leader of the party. So currently we see many Republicans look at Donald Trump as the leader of the Republican Party, similar to Democrats with Barack Obama. The problem is the Constitution isn't designed for the president to be the leader of Congress. They are supposed to have a checks and balance system, and Congress is supposed to be prepared to challenge the president if the president is making decisions that Congress feels it is not in their best interest. But we don't see that as much anymore because there is this need for Congress to feel they have to protect the president. We also have seen similarly the Supreme Court nominees used as a political tool. And so that's something that also has eroded the separation of powers. These are supposed to be three separate branches of government that keep an eye on one another. And we're seeing that has been chipped away a little bit. And so some of the results of that process has been more polarization between Democrats and Republicans, and a greater focus of party over policies, that rather than voting for the policies that are in their best interests, voting for whoever the political party you identify with has become more important to legislators and voters. More voting along party lines. So we see there's a vote for a certain policy and we already have an understanding that Democrats will vote one way and Republicans will vote another, and we don't see as much crossing over lines. And a good example of this more recently has been the impeachment trial, where Mitt Romney, a Republican, actually on one of the articles of impeachment voted against Donald Trump. And that has become a lot and has received a lot of political backlash on that. And pressure to pass policies that are politically safe, that are going to appease the political party rather than become a problem with the political party. This can really impede on innovation in policy, or if there are policies that the other party is proposing that you feel would benefit your constituency, not voting for those. And those are also problematic. So what does a divided Congress look like? And so, and this is adapted from a presentation of one of the trainings, and I thought that this was really interesting. And in fact, I think that this graph really inspired me to talk about this today. So here we have on the y-axis the number of senators in the Senate, and on the x-axis moving from the left liberal to moderate and to the right conservative. And what we see in this shape is that there are a lot of people who are either leaning towards liberal and leaning towards conservative. And actually, and here are some senators. So the government actually ranks all of the senators based on their policy positions from most conservative to most liberal. Kamala Harris actually is listed as the least conservative person right now in the Senate. So she's all the way here on the left. And we have all the way on the right, we have Ted Cruz of Texas. But here we have right in the center, Senator Robert Portman, who's a Republican from Ohio, who's the 51st on that list. So right around the center. Now here's how we can see where this is a problem. So here is the 51st right there in the center, and look at how far away the 60th senator is. So there is a big divide between the congressional or the political groups. There isn't a lot of overlap. And this is with a conservative president, but what's further complicated this is that if we look at where Donald Trump has placed his policy positions, they're kind of all over the place. Some of them are more liberal, some of them are moderate, and some of them are conservative. And so, so we have this president who's very unpredictable in political positions, but we have a divided Congress. What has this looked like in the past before Congress was so divided? So compare that last graph with this one, where we see there's few people on the very liberal or the very conservative ends, and look at how close together the 60th senator is and the 51st senator. So here is where in the moderate level where we see the most senators, and this has been in past Congresses, we see that there's more room for compromise because people in the middle, there's more moderates and they're more close together in policy positions. So I'm gonna flip back, compare these two graphs. That's pretty interesting, but we can also see from this graph why it seems like today Congress cannot collaborate more than they used to. So why is this all so confusing? Why do we get so confused about this? And sometimes none of it seems to make sense. So first, both parties are really struggling with maintaining a cohesive identity, even though I've said before in this presentation that Republicans have done a better job. So for instance, with Democrats, we have moderates versus progressives, and we've seen this play out in the political, primary election. So, and even when we whittled down all the candidates, we came down to voting between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders being very progressive and Joe Biden being viewed as more moderate. And so dividing the political or the Democratic Party between those. For Republicans, it has been quote unquote Trump Republicans versus traditional conservatives, because there have been a lot of policies that have come out of the White House that aren't really in alignment, as I showed you earlier in the graph, with traditional conservative values. And so in my trainings in Washington, both Democrats and Republicans gave us trainings, and I found it interesting, many of the Republicans specifically outlined that they were Reagan Republicans or fiscal conservatives. They were very specific to show that it was traditional conservative values. There also have been a lot of changes to the media. So for instance, with social media, we've seen this term fake news come up. And what has been really sad about this is that fake news is actually a thing, but what it really is It's these groups, especially those outside of the United States, but also groups inside the United States that really want to disrupt the political system, are just making up stories that are very harmful. And one of the most famous ones, if you never heard of it, is called Pizzagate, where there was a story that was going out in social media that Hillary Clinton was a pedophile and she was abusing children in this pizza restaurant. I believe it was in New York or New Jersey. And this man in North Carolina read this story. He became so concerned about the children that he took guns to the pizza place to go free these children. And they were so freaked out. And also the bad publicity that this pizza parlor, which was randomly selected for this story, suffered economically because of this fake story. It was fake news, completely made up. But what we've seen the term fake news be used as something more, I don't agree with that news. So you're writing a story that I don't like how I was characterized, fake news. News is news. It could be poorly created news, but to call real news fake news has been very dangerous, because then we can just really blow off anything that we don't agree with, that we read about in the media. Another change to the media is commentary disguised as news. It used to be that news was just news. There would have been an opinion section of the newspaper, or maybe at the evening news, at the end, somebody would provide some commentary. But now we see people, and they might be experts, and they might have really good or interesting, thoughtful analysis, being brought together to talk about their opinions, and it's presented as news, and it's not news. News is the reporting of facts and events, not necessarily people's opinions about those facts and events. And so it's become less clear what are factual events that have taken place or what is going on than just what somebody's opinion is about what's going on. And there's also a lot of political bias of news sources. So here's a chart that, that shows where different news sources are on the political scale, and also the quality of reporting. So at the top, we see the best journalism that we can identify. We have the Associated Press, Reuters, Bloomberg. These are all CBS News, ABC News. These would be considered news sources that do the best journalism work that they can to report facts and the original facts. As we move down, we see that there are news sources that are focused on analysis. And so that goes back to what I said about commentary versus real news. These might offer really good analysis, but it's still analysis and not necessarily news. If we go to the bottom, and there's a red box at the bottom, these are not news at all. They're often found to be misleading or inaccurate or just fabricated. And so these are very dangerous sources of news that we might look at and turn to for information. And this is, oh, let me go back. And this is on both sides of the political spectrum. We see fabricated news from liberal sources and conservative sources. And so, so where we decide to get our news is very important, but we have so many choices, and it's not always clear to the voting public what is a really good source and what is not a really good source, and whether or not they're looking at sources that just are in alignment with our existing opinion, as opposed to something where we can learn new facts and maybe challenge our opinion as well. So you might want to also consider whether you need to change where you're getting your sources of news, or, like I like to do, get news from a variety of sources where you can compare what different sources are reporting about individual events and topics, and seeing if they are all in agreement with one another. So what can we do? So I've talked about a lot of the problems that we have seen occur over time, and changes to government. So first, learn more about what the parties stand for. If you feel that you identify as a Republican or as a Democrat, have you really looked at what those parties have traditionally stood for? Because if you are just going based on what people say they stand for, well, then that might mean that what really was traditionally a Democratic value or a Republican value might be different than what you're seeing it as today. And so learning more about what the parties stand for and their different political stances is important. And so you might find that you like some of their policy positions, but not all of them. And so that might lead you to question, do I vote for people based on just that they are part of the party that I identify with, or do I have to learn more about that candidate to find out whether or not that they agree with these personal policy decisions, because I might feel different about it than what the overall party does. This is very important in primaries. So for instance, if you are a Democrat and you were voted or are voting in the primaries this year, you had a choice between different Democratic candidates, and you had to look at the different policy stances that each of those candidates had, because you can't just vote blindly Democratic. Though that mattered whether you had a Democrat that was pushing for Medicare for all, as opposed to strengthening Obamacare as it was initially intended. Vote based on policy, not party alone. So that goes along with what I was saying about learning about what the policies, the parties stand for. So making sure that you're voting based on policy, because policy is actually what's going to affect you at the end of the day, not just the party alone. And learn more about what candidates do rather what they say. Candidates can tell us that they want to do so many things. And I always take that with a grain of salt, because, for instance, if somebody's running for president, they might have really interesting and exciting ideas, but if I don't think that those ideas are really ideas that can move through Congress and get approved, then it doesn't really make a difference if that's what the person is backing for me. So looking at how people have voted, what steps have they taken to move through their policy positions and get their policy agenda on the table, those are things to really look at. And don't share media stories that cannot be verified. It's harmful. I explained to you about the issue of Pizzagate. That sounds really crazy that happened, but it did. It can be very harmful if we're spreading information. And I see people on Facebook who will post, and it's interesting. Sometimes they say, they'll comment, not sure if it's true, but it can't hurt to repost. And yes, it can, because then you're spreading information that's not necessarily true. Fact check, and fact checked. So if you see something so for instance, with the CARES Act, somebody told me that they were very upset that Congress built in raises for themselves in the CARES Act. And so I said, where did you hear that? And they said, well, I read the policy. And so I looked up the CARES Act, the actual legislation, it was 240 pages. So I don't think that the person read it. And when I went back and I said, you read that policy? It was 240 pages long. And the person said, oh no, I read an article about it. So here we go again, where it's not the actual facts, it's what somebody is saying. And when I looked into what they were talking about, Congress set aside money for itself to help with things like childcare and extra security while they were working on coronavirus issues. And so there really wasn't any raise that they were voting for themselves, but it's very easy and quick to spread like wildfire when something is not true. And most of all, vote. Don't let the challenges of the political parties stop you from voting. Use it as a tool in order to educate yourself and become more empowered and emboldened as a voter. And that's my presentation. And I guess we can have discussion afterwards.
Yes, the floor is open for questions and from students, faculty, staff that's on the call. If you have any questions.
I can't imagine. I just, in this current political environment, I just talked a whole bunch about Republicans and Democrats and nobody has anything to say. Maybe my goal of making a bipartisan presentation about politics worked.
Oh, that's good, actually. I have it's not a question, Dr. Ruggiano, but a concern or maybe a statement. So with everything that you just stated, great presentation, a lot of good information. With the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, do you see in your own, I guess, view the third party coming about amongst, because there's so much confusion amongst sometimes the Democrats and Republicans, and the viewpoint is changing now amongst people? Do you see a third party coming, or more people gearing, I guess, leaning towards a third party?
I think people want a third party. I think there are a lot of people who want a third party. Some people view independence as a third party, but that's not really reliable, because there's some people who are independents, but they're more conservative. They don't want to join the Republican Party. And then there are other independents who are more liberal, but they don't want to join the Democratic Party. And so we don't see a third party that's very unified. And until you would get a third unified party, I mean, I think a third party could really help with a lot of these problems we see in Congress, because when it wouldn't just be two polarized groups fighting against one another, there would be a third party that can either push policy forward or stop policy from moving forward, and just on principle and not just party disagreements. But you would need a unified third party, and I don't know what that would look like. We saw with the previous elections, the Tea Party coming together and calling themselves the Tea Party, and that didn't really pan out as its own political party, but it did change the Republican Party. And so when we did see a group trying to band together for some other type of policy movement, it was really, it really went back into the Republican Party, and it did affect the elections. We saw an increasingly conservative Congress come out of that, but it wasn't really a third party in of itself.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a comment from a student. Let me, and any other questions while I'm going to the chat section? Okay, we had one student, Carla Durham, stated that you mentioned about HIT at the beginning, but she didn't catch the acronym meaning.
Oh, it's health information technology. So my team has actually built an app for dementia caregivers to help them navigate the healthcare system better for somebody with dementia and to communicate with doctors. But health information technology is a HIT.
Thank you, Dr. Ruggiano. I had one more statement from a student, Tracy Wharton, asked if you can speak to the need to pay attention to the state versus federal levels of government, I guess. What influence did she see at the federal level of the state legislative bodies?
Wait, can you repeat the last part of the question?
She asked, what influence did you see at the federal level of the state legislative bodies?
So hi, Tracy, thanks for your question. So I feel that the state level policies or governments are really following suit with the federal government. So for instance, with the coronavirus, we saw more Democratic governors making movements towards shelter-in-place policies and supporting the community than the Republican-led states. And so they were waiting for the White House to actually make some moves before they made their decision. So I think that a lot of this issue has really trickled down to the state and local governments about political parties. We see, similar to the federal government, that in some states, they'll go back and forth between parties. And so if you've noticed with the federal government, we had just even the past, too, in some states, Now, other states are more unified. So in Alabama, we see that Republicans really keep control of the state and local governments outside of a few communities. But remember what I said about the cohesiveness of the Republican Party. So when you already have a strong Republican or Democratic state, it probably will stay there. But we do see really what's going on in the state and local governments being very similar political wise to the federal government in most states, not all states.
Thank you, Dr. Ruggiano. We have another question. Any comments about the straight party ballot options? Do any other states have this option?
Other states do. I'm not sure if all of them do, but yeah, so you can actually go and just vote in Alabama, just Republican, and then all the Republicans would be would vote. You would be voting for, or all Democrat. But that kind of really buys in with what I've been saying about people not really looking into candidates and looking at the political party. In those cases, if you do that, you are just voting for everybody in a single party, whether or not you've really looked into whether that person really sees the same viewpoint as you or doesn't. And that can be problematic. I get very frustrated with a lot of state and local positions where we never hear anything from the candidates. So in both Florida and Alabama, I have become very frustrated that people run for as judges, but you can't really find anything on their records. And so that has really frustrated me, because if I don't know how a judge has made decisions in the past, how am I supposed to vote for him or her in an election? So in some cases, we're not even given information about those candidates. But if you just click the box for Republican or Democrat, you're blindly voting for people who you didn't really look into what they stand for.
Thank you. Trying to see if we have any more questions. Okay, we have one more from a student.
Sure.
From a policy advocacy perspective, did Dr. Ruggiano experience any politicians who would stray from their parties based on their individual voting history? Or would they use the United Party to bolster support for something they felt strongly about?
So I think, this we see happening more when the politician strays away from their party if they feel that that strayed viewpoint would be very popular with their own constituents. So for instance, so I gave the example of Mitt Romney voted against the president in one of the impeachment articles. However, he cited his religious and moral values and said that he reflected on those, and he felt based on his religion and his morals, he could not vote alongside with the other Republicans, and that was how he voted. But he also is a senator from a state that is it has a lot of religious overtones, and he has been critical of the president in the past and has still been successful in politics. So here was a case where he went apart from the rest of the party, but he felt that that wasn't something that was going to hurt him with his constituents, or maybe it would be his constituents would support. In the meantime, we also see politicians who are in one party or another, but they're very moderate. So for instance, California is a very progressive state policy-wise, and we see it often vote Democratic, but it's many of its governors have been Republican. So so that's also interesting case too. So everything that I'm saying today, it's not just cut and dry. There are so many different places in the middle. But yeah, I think that, well, even with the Democratic Party right now, Medicare for all is not so popular with everybody. And so, so those politicians that are running on Medicare for all and supporting Medicare for all, technically they're diverging from what their moderate Democratic colleagues want. So we do see that.
Dr. Ruggiano, we have one question. Staff member wants to know, what source did you get your information from? And I'm thinking maybe information pertaining to the, I guess, the PowerPoint or your history or in DC.
So some of it I got from just my knowledge of politics and policies, because I did mention I have a PhD in public policy, and most of my work in the past has been in policy advocacy and policy analysis. A lot of it has been from, and I do have sources at the bottom of some of the slides. I took a lot of what I learned from the experts who did our trainings in DC. So for instance, if I look at the charts where I showed the divided government, let me go back to, let's see. Sarah Binder, who is a policy expert and a faculty member at George Washington University. So she's written several books on politics, and so I adapted those slides from her work, and I gave her credit for it as well. The open source for media, that was something from a website that focuses on politics and the media. So there's different sources I drew upon, but if there are specific questions, people can feel free to email me and I can send them information.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then the ranking of the legislators, and that's why I adapted it, because when I did the training, there were different people in the Senate. And so the ranking came from the federal government. So, I mean, I looked at the federal government. But in terms of policy specifically, like I talked about the CARES Act, you can go onto the congressional website and get a PDF of any bill that has been introduced or a bill that has been passed, and you can read it word for word what they say. I'm a policy nerd, so I actually go do that. So when I had a question about what somebody posted on Facebook about the CARES Act, I actually went to the federal government website and I looked up the bill, and I read the parts of it that pertain to that.
Okay, we have another question, very interesting question here. A student wanted to know if you felt Trump had a polarizing leadership style or unified.
So I feel like the outcome of Donald Trump has been more unified within the Republican Party. I feel that because of his popularity with Republicans has strengthened Republicans as a cohesive group. However, there is a lot of division, for instance, where the policies that have been coming out of the White House, not all of them are really in support of traditional congressional values or conservative values. For instance, so taxes are not popular with Republicans in general, but when we saw changes to tax policy the other year, that was very much in support by the president, but it also increased the federal deficit by an alarming amount. And so a federal deficit is not something that traditional conservatives have supported. They really support more fiscal responsibility. I feel like between the two parties, so that's within that party, but I also feel like many of the things that things he has said and actions he has taken have really moved to divide between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. There have been cases where he has worked on bipartisan projects with Congress, so that has taken place. But I think if we look at the situation overall, there hasn't really been a lot of work to try to unify Republicans and Democrats in general.
Thank you. Any other questions? All great questions, by the way.
They are great questions.
Okay, I think we might have one more. We do have one more question here. Shay would like to know suggestions from you on ways social workers can effectively advocate in a polarizing government.
So I think when we talk about whether or not the government is polarized, that we can always advocate for policies. And I think that advocacy really looks the same way. The problem is when Congress is more polarized, there are the opposing party is going to be less likely to maybe switch a decision based on your advocacy. So, so one way that we can get involved in advocacy is first learning more about policies and then educating other people in the community about those policies. And so, so that's one thing. Also, teaching other people how to act. Once we learn how to get involved, and getting involved with advocacy can be as easy as writing an email to a legislator, and we write emails all the time. So it doesn't necessarily have to be this long, really huge effort to advocate. In fact, last November, I gave a talk to about 200 dementia caregivers in Birmingham, and I was telling them what the federal government, they've been doing and what they are doing for dementia care. And at the end, I actually taught them how to write an email about their experience and what they feel is needed in their community to a legislator. And so that was something very simple where I gave them the information how to contact the legislators and how to put together a simple message. We don't have to make policy advocacy a large part of our work. And I've even written research articles on this. Social workers as a whole do not typically get involved with policy because they don't feel that it relates to what they're doing in direct practice. And the way that I talk about this is policy advocacy is part of the NASW Code of Ethics. NASW tells us policy is so important that all of us need to be advocates, even if it's not our top, job requirement. But to say, I don't get involved with policy and that's okay, how do we just pick and choose what parts of the code of ethics that we should follow? So somebody who might say, oh, I don't get involved in policy, but that's okay with me. How do they feel about confidentiality? How do they feel about being a competent social worker? All these other things that are in our values. We shouldn't pick and choose just because we maybe are not as comfortable or we have other parts of social work that we have duties in. As I mentioned, it could be as easy as an email. So we all have the ability to, so if you're in your workday, if you have found the time to write a personal email to somebody, that's as easy as writing to a legislator.
Thank you. And Dr. Ruggiano, I know you talked about fake news, so a couple of questions came through. What are some reliable news sources to get accurate information that you suggest to watch or listen to?
Mm-hmm. So I always listen to the National Public Radio, and also traditional print sources are usually good sources of information. So I typically read the New York Times. I also I listen to NPR. But I also read other sources as well. So, I'll look at something like the Wall Street Journal, because that's a more conservative newspaper. I tend to look at a variety of sources to see what people say. Sometimes I even check in to see, to listen to Rush Limbaugh and see what he's talking about in terms of the current events, because I feel like the more diverse perspectives I hear help either let me know that my opinion about a policy or an event is pretty accurate, or it can challenge what I'm thinking and maybe I would think about something a different way.
Thank you.
But I think personally, I think that the New York Times does a really great job. And if you have an account with the university, it's only $10 a month to the New York Times. So it's very affordable. And NPR, of course, I mean, they really would love for you to pledge, but otherwise it's not a costly source of news.
Great to know. And I think that's all the questions. I would like to close it out with one question. By me being the student service coordinator and being the advisor for the MSW students, I do hear from a lot of students who indicate policy is not what they want to do. And I know you mentioned that briefly. So with that being said, and policy is a huge part that I think of social work, and students telling me that, hey, I'm not interested in policy, do you think there's a bridge that they have to know a little about policy in order to do social work effectively, or can they actually disregard policy and actually be a great social worker?
So first, I always joke around that I teach the trifecta of hated social work courses because I typically teach policy, research, and macro practice. So I know that it's not popular. I think there's a couple reasons why policy is not as popular with students. One, social work education in general has viewed policy as a course that anybody can teach. So for instance, CSWE requires that you have practice experience if you're going to teach a practice class. But what I see in job candidates who have very little practice experience, they say, well, I can teach policy, but they haven't really done a lot of policy work. I have done a lot of policy work, and so I find that students get very engaged in policy in my classes, but I'm able to show them how it's relevant to their daily social work practice. And I think that that's really the important thing. I think students do need to learn about policy, but they don't have to learn about all policies. If they are in child welfare, for instance, keeping up to date with child welfare policies is important. For instance, look at what is going on in the past year or so with immigration policy. So if you are working with immigrants and refugees and you're not following what's going on with the federal government and state governments in terms of immigration, that's really a disservice to your clients. And so you don't have to become an expert in all areas of policy, but if you find certain policy areas that are relevant to your everyday social work practice, I think that students and social workers would find policy more relevant, more accessible and understandable, and more enjoyable of a topic to talk about because they can inform themselves more and have a lot more to say about them.
Good information. Okay, so I guess that will conclude our session for this Lunch and Learn. I do have two announcements. The first announcement, students, faculty, and staff on this call, please do not forget to complete your census. You all should have received information either by mail or a phone call, but if not, information will be going out, I think, next week as well. So if you can, and if you have that information, please complete it and send it in. It's very important. The second thing is, this is our last Lunch and Learn On Your Vote series that ended with Dr. Nicole Ruggiano. So I would like to just give the Diversity Committee a hand, students, faculty, and staff, and all of our speakers a hand for making this On Your Vote series a success. This started back in September of last year, and actually this is our last one today. So it was a great ride, a lot of great information, and we're hoping that the students, faculty and staff and community partners will take this information, go out into the community and do what they have to do to make sure everyone get out to vote. And so thank you, Dr. Ruggiano, for spreading the information that you talked about. It was very insightful. And we would like to just say thank you again for taking time to present to our students, faculty, and staff on your topic of this series. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, and if we have any students that would like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, if it's okay, can you forward me a copy that I can send out to the students? Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, everyone, and be safe. Enjoy your day, and please look out for other emails in regards to activities and Lunch and Learns from the Diversity Committee in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Maureen. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nicole, thanks. That was great.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole.
Thank you. Excellent job, Nicole. That was wonderful information.
Thank you.
Thank you.